In the remote stillness of the Colorado wilderness, where the forest keeps its secrets and survival is often a matter of instinct, a tiny golden retriever puppy is left to fend for itself. Alone, abandoned, and barely clinging to life. But nature has a way of surprising us. And sometimes, the wild breaks its own rules. When a fierce and elusive bobcat emerges from the shadows, the last thing anyone expects is compassion. But what unfolds next is a breathtaking twist that no one, man nor beast, could have predicted. How far will one wild mother bobcat can go for a creature not her own? And what force could possibly bring predator and prey together in a bond that defies every natural law? Stay with us, because this isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of heart, of instinct, and of a connection that changes everything. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The Colorado wilderness had never felt so vast and empty to Jack Thompson as it did on this particular autumn morning. At 68 years old, the retired park ranger had spent most of his life surrounded by the quiet majesty of the Rocky Mountain forests. Yet today, as the first light of dawn filtered through the ponderosa pines outside his cabin window, he felt a peculiar restlessness. Jack's weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee as he gazed at the mountain ridge that had been his backdrop for the past 15 years. His retirement cabin sat on the edge of Roosevelt National Forest, a sanctuary he'd once patrolled and protected. These days, his protection extended only to the occasional injured bird or the vegetable garden he tended behind his modest home. "Looks like rain's coming, Rusty," he mumbled to the aging chocolate Labrador sprawled across the worn rug by the fireplace. Rusty lifted his graying muzzle briefly, acknowledging his master's voice before settling back into his morning doze. Jack smiled at his loyal companion. At 12 years old, Rusty had slowed considerably, but their bond had only deepened with time. Man and dog had weathered life's storms together. The death of Jack's wife, Margaret, 7 years ago, his subsequent retirement, and their relocation to this remote cabin where healing could begin. The forecast had predicted storms for the next 3 days, which meant Jack needed to check his emergency supplies and bring in extra firewood. Setting his coffee down, he slipped into his jacket and work boots. "I'll be back soon, old boy," he said, patting Rusty's head. "Just gonna make sure we're set for the storm." Outside, the autumn air carried a distinct chill that whispered of the coming winter. Jack's breath formed small clouds as he made his way to the woodshed. The forest surrounding his property seemed unusually quiet, the typical morning chorus of birds noticeably absent. In his years as a ranger, Jack had learned to read the forest's moods, and today, something felt different. As he stacked logs into a wheelbarrow, a sound carried on the wind, so faint he almost missed it. Jack straightened, his back protesting after decades of physical labor, and listened intently. There it was again, a high-pitched cry that didn't belong to any wildlife he recognized. It sounded almost like, "A puppy?" he muttered to himself, his brow furrowing in confusion. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the mountain road, and they didn't have dogs. Abandoning the half-filled wheelbarrow, Jack followed the sound, which grew more distinct as he approached the tree line at the edge of his property. 2 days earlier, a blue pickup truck had rumbled up the narrow Forest Service road that wound through the densest part of the wilderness. Behind the wheel, a man in his 30s with bloodshot eyes and 3 days' stubble gripped the steering wheel with sweaty palms. In the passenger seat, a small canvas duffel bag occasionally shifted and emitted muffled whimpers. "Shut up already," the man snapped, jabbing a finger at the bag. Almost there. The truck came to a stop at a small turnout, the engine sputtering before falling silent. The man grabbed the duffel bag, which now squirmed more vigorously, and stepped out into the cool forest air. He looked around nervously before unzipping the bag and unceremoniously dumping its contents onto the ground. A tiny golden retriever puppy, no more than 8 weeks old, tumbled out and immediately began to shiver. Its honey-colored coat was matted, and hunger had left its small frame thinner than it should have been. "This is your stop, mutt," the man said coldly. "Can't afford to feed you, and the shelter wants $80 to take you. This is better for both of us." The puppy looked up with dark, trusting eyes, wagging its tail hesitantly in the presence of its owner. It had no concept of abandonment, no understanding of the cruelty being inflicted upon it. "Don't look at me like that," the man muttered, already backing toward his truck. "Some hiker will find you. Or maybe you'll—" He didn't finish the thought, unwilling to verbalize the puppy's likely fate in the wilderness. The truck's door slammed, and the engine roared to life, drowning out the puppy's first frightened yelp. As the sound of the vehicle faded down the mountain road, the golden retriever pup sat trembling, utterly alone in a world it didn't understand. By nightfall, hunger and fear had driven the puppy to wander from the roadside. Its instincts, though undeveloped, urged it to seek shelter and warmth. With no mother to guide it and no training to fall back on, the puppy stumbled deeper into the forest, occasionally crying out in hope that someone, anyone, would answer. Not far from where the puppy now huddled beneath a fallen log, a female bobcat emerged from her den beneath a rocky overhang. At 3 years old, she was in her prime, a skilled hunter with a muscular, compact body perfectly adapted to the mountain terrain. Her tawny coat, spotted and striped in patterns that provided ideal camouflage, rippled as she stretched in the fading light. Behind her, 3 small kittens mewed softly, demanding their mother's attention. Born in early summer, they were now old enough to eat solid food but still dependent on their mother's protection and hunting prowess. The bobcat mother had been unusually successful this season. Her territory was rich with rabbits, squirrels, and mice, allowing her to maintain a den closer to the forest edge than she might normally prefer. The mother bobcat's ears twitched at the sound of her offspring, but another noise had caught her attention, an unfamiliar cry that nevertheless triggered a maternal response. One of her kittens had wandered from the den a week earlier, only to return hungry and frightened after a day's absence. Something in this distant cry reminded her of that incident. Moving with silent precision, the bobcat slipped through the underbrush toward the source of the sound. Her whiskers vibrated with sensory information as she paused to scent the air. The smell was wrong. Not the musky scent of her own kind, but something different. Something that should trigger her instinct to retreat, or, potentially, to hunt. Yet the crying continued, pitiful and weak, stirring something deep in her nature that transcended the usual boundaries between predator and prey. By the second morning of its abandonment, the golden retriever puppy had grown significantly weaker. Dehydration had set in, and without the skills to hunt or scavenge, hunger had left it lethargic. Its once enthusiastic cries had diminished to occasional whimpers as it lay beneath the fallen log, its honey-colored coat now dirty and tangled with pine needles and mud. In the stillness of dawn, the puppy's ears perked up at the sound of soft footfalls approaching its makeshift shelter. Too exhausted to run, it could only watch as a shadow fell across the opening of its hiding place. The mother bobcat stood motionless, her amber eyes fixed on the small creature before her. Her nostrils flared as she processed the puppy's scent, her tail twitching slightly in indecision. Every instinct told her this was not her lost kitten, but something else entirely. Something that belonged to the world of humans, creatures she had learned to avoid at all costs. Yet as the puppy let out another weak whimper and attempted to wag its tail, something unexpected happened. The mother bobcat, rather than retreating or attacking, took a step closer. Perhaps it was the similarity in size between the puppy and her own young, or maybe some deeper, inexplicable connection. But in that moment, her maternal instincts overrode her natural caution. With gentle precision, the bobcat gripped the scruff of the puppy's neck in her teeth, the same way she would carry one of her own kittens. The puppy went limp instinctively, a response programmed into both wild and domestic canines. With her precious cargo secured, the bobcat melted back into the forest, moving swiftly toward her den. When the mother bobcat returned to her rocky shelter, her 3 kittens greeted her with curious mews, their spotted bodies circling her legs as she carefully deposited the puppy on the soft grass that lined their home. The kittens approached the newcomer cautiously, their blue-gold eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear or aggression. The puppy, revived somewhat by the movement and change of scene, struggled to its feet and wagged its tail weakly. In its limited experience, other warm bodies meant companionship and, potentially, food. The bobcat kittens, still young enough to be playful and accepting, soon began to nudge and paw at the strange creature in their midst. Their mother watched this interaction carefully, ready to intervene if necessary. When the puppy collapsed again from exhaustion, she approached and began to groom its dirty coat with her rough tongue. It wasn't her offspring, but it was now under her protection, at least temporarily. As night fell, the unlikely family huddled together for warmth. The puppy, surrounded by the vibrating warmth of purring wildcats, slept deeply for the first time since its abandonment. By the 3rd morning, however, reality began to assert itself. The mother bobcat had brought back a rabbit for her kittens, but the puppy, attempting to join the meal, could not consume the raw meat. Its pitiful attempts to suckle from the bobcat mother were similarly unsuccessful. The biological differences between them created an insurmountable barrier to the puppy's survival. The bobcat paced the entrance to her den, torn between her unexplainable attachment to this alien creature and the practical knowledge that she could not keep it alive. Her own kittens required her care and teaching. They could not afford to have her energy diverted to a baby that wasn't even of her species. As dawn broke, the mother bobcat made her decision. Once again, taking the increasingly weak puppy by the scruff, she left her den and began a journey through the forest. Not deeper into the wilderness, but toward its edge, where the scent of humans occasionally drifted on the breeze. Jack Thompson had spent over an hour searching for the source of the cries when they abruptly stopped. Concerned, he expanded his search perimeter, venturing farther into the forest than he'd initially intended. The gathering storm clouds overhead warned him to turn back soon. But something, call it a ranger's instinct or simply human compassion, drove him to continue. "Hello," he called out, knowing it was unlikely he'd receive a response, but hoping to trigger another sound that might guide his search. "Anybody out there?" Only the whisper of wind through the pines answered him. Jack was about to admit defeat when Rusty, who had limped out to join the search despite his arthritic hips, began to bark urgently from several yards away. "What is it, boy?" Jack hurried toward his dog, who stood rigid, his tail straight out behind him in the classic pointer position. Following Rusty's gaze, Jack spotted movement in a small clearing ahead, something tawny and low to the ground. His first thought was, mountain lion, and he instinctively reached for the pepper spray he still carried out of habit. But as he squinted against the morning light, the shape resolved into a smaller wildcat, a bobcat, and it appeared to be carrying something. Jack froze, not wanting to startle the animal. Rusty, surprisingly, remained silent now, watching the scene with an almost eerie calmness. Years of working in wildlife management had taught Jack when to intervene and when to let nature take its course, and this moment called for patient observation. The bobcat paused at the edge of the clearing, looking directly at Jack with unblinking amber eyes. It was then that he noticed what the wildcat carried: a small, golden-furred puppy, limp but still breathing in the bobcat's gentle grip. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack whispered, his mind racing to make sense of the scene before him. As if responding to his voice, the bobcat carefully set the puppy down on a patch of soft moss. She stood over it protectively for a moment, gave it one final grooming lick, then backed away several steps, still watching Jack intently. Understanding dawned slowly. "You're bringing it to me," Jack said softly. "Aren't you, Mama?" The bobcat's ear twitched, but she held her ground, her gaze alternating between the man and the puppy. Jack recognized the intelligence in those wild eyes, and something more, a deliberate intent that transcended his understanding of animal behavior. With agonizing slowness, Jack knelt and extended his hand, palm down, non-threatening. "It's okay," he murmured. "I understand." The bobcat watched for several more seconds before seeming to come to a decision. With one last look at the puppy, she turned and disappeared into the underbrush, a ghost melting back into the forest. Only then did Jack approach the abandoned puppy. Its condition was dire: dehydrated, malnourished, and barely responsive. Yet as he gently lifted the tiny creature, it managed to lick his hand weakly. "You're safe now, little one," Jack promised, tucking the puppy inside his jacket for warmth. "Let's get you home." Back at the cabin, Jack worked methodically to save the puppy's life. He mixed a solution of warm water, sugar, and a pinch of salt, a makeshift rehydration treatment he'd learned during his ranger training. Using a turkey baster from his kitchen, he carefully administered small amounts to the puppy, who gradually began to show signs of improvement. "Rusty, I think we've got a fighter here," Jack told his old lab, who had planted himself beside the cardboard box where the puppy now rested on a soft towel. As evening approached and the storm finally broke overhead, Jack sat beside the fireplace, watching the rise and fall of the puppy's chest as it slept. His mind kept returning to the bobcat, her deliberate actions, her apparent decision to bring the puppy to a human for care. "I've seen a lot of strange things in these mountains," he said to Rusty, "but never anything like that." The incident had stirred memories he'd long kept buried. 25 years earlier, during his early days as a ranger, Jack had encountered a similar situation in reverse. A severe flash flood had washed out a section of forest, and in the aftermath, search teams had discovered a bobcat kitten, miraculously alive but separated from its mother. Against protocol, Jack had taken the kitten home temporarily, bottle feeding it until it was strong enough to be transferred to a wildlife rehabilitation center. "I wonder," he mused aloud, staring into the dancing flames. Could it possibly be the same Bobcat? The timeline could fit, though it stretched the boundaries of coincidence. Bobcats could live 15 to 20 years in the wild, and they often remained in the same territory throughout their lives if resources remained plentiful. It was impossible to know for certain, yet the symmetry of the situation struck Jack as meaningful regardless. Life had a way of coming full circle, of balancing debts in unexpected ways. In the days that followed, the puppy, whom Jack named Scout, gained strength rapidly. A visit to the veterinarian in the nearest town confirmed that Scout was approximately 8 weeks old, malnourished but otherwise healthy, and likely a purebred golden retriever. Someone abandoned this dog deliberately, the vet, Dr. Martinez, stated with barely concealed anger. You see these cases more often than you'd think. People get a puppy without realizing the commitment, then dump it when it becomes inconvenient. Jack nodded grimly. I've found abandoned pets in the forest before. Never one that was rescued by a wild animal, though. Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow skeptically. A bobcat, you said? She shook her head. That goes against everything we know about predator behavior. I know what I saw, Elena, Jack insisted quietly. He'd known the vet for nearly 2 decades. She had treated Rusty since he was a puppy. I can't explain it either, but that mother bobcat was protecting this puppy, not hunting it. Dr. Martinez's expression softened. Life in the wild doesn't always follow the textbook. I've seen unlikely bonds form between species before, though never quite like this. She scratched Scout behind the ears, earning an enthusiastic tail wag. One thing's for certain, this little guy owes his life to both of you. As autumn deepened into winter, Scout grew into his paws and his personality. Unlike many dogs, he showed no fear of the forest, often sitting at the edge of Jack's property, gazing into the trees as if waiting for something, or someone. Jack found himself watching the forest line as well, hoping for another glimpse of the bobcat mother. Though he spotted her tracks occasionally in fresh snow near his cabin, the wildcat herself remained elusive. One crisp December morning, Jack awoke to find Scout missing from his usual place at the foot of the bed. Concerned, he called for the puppy, but no pattering of paws answered him. Rusty, however, seemed unconcerned, watching Jack with his calm brown eyes from his cushion in the corner. "Where's Scout, Rusty?" "Do you know?" Jack asked, already pulling on his boots and jacket. The old lab heaved himself to his feet and ambled to the front door, looking back at Jack expectantly. Outside, the world had been transformed by an overnight snowfall. 3 inches of pristine white powder covered the ground, and Jack immediately spotted Scout's small paw prints leading from the porch toward the forest edge. Feeling a prickle of unease, he followed them, calling the puppy's name. At the tree line, Jack stopped short. There in the snow was Scout, sitting perfectly still facing the forest. And before him, equally motionless, sat the mother bobcat. Neither animal made a sound as they regarded each other across a small clearing, separated by perhaps 10 feet of open ground. Jack held his breath, afraid to disrupt whatever silent communication was taking place. After what seemed like minutes, but was likely only seconds, the bobcat took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between herself and the puppy. Scout remained sitting, his tail now sweeping a small arc in the snow. Not the frantic wag of excitement, but a gentle, deliberate greeting. When the bobcat was just 2 feet away, she paused, then lowered herself into a crouch, her eyes never leaving the puppy's. From the cover of a juniper bush nearby came movement, and Jack watched in amazement as 3 half-grown bobcat kittens emerged cautiously. They approached Scout with the same curiosity they had shown in the den, circling him, occasionally touching noses. The scene before him defied explanation, yet Jack understood he was witnessing something profound, a reunion, or perhaps a farewell. The mother bobcat had not simply saved Scout's life through some momentary aberration of instinct. She had formed a connection with him, one strong enough to bring her back to the edge of human territory despite the risks. After several minutes, the mother bobcat rose and made a soft chirping sound. Her kittens immediately responded, breaking off their inspection of Scout and returning to her side. With one last long look at the puppy, she turned and led her family back into the forest depths, vanishing as silently as they had appeared. Scout watched them go, his young face somehow solemn in a way that belied his age. Only when the last trace of the wildcats had disappeared did he turn and trot back to Jack's side, pressing against his leg as if seeking reassurance. "You've got family in these woods, Scout," Jack said softly, kneeling to embrace the puppy. "And so do I." Spring came to the mountains with a riot of wildflowers and birdsong. Scout, now nearly full-grown, had become Jack's constant companion on his daily hikes, showing an intelligence and awareness of the forest that impressed even the experienced ranger. "You're a special one," Jack often told him, watching as Scout navigated the trail with confidence, occasionally stopping to point out wildlife that Jack might have missed. Rusty had taken to the role of elder statesman, watching Scout's antics with dignified tolerance and occasionally joining in when his old bones allowed. The 3 of them had formed a family of sorts, filling Jack's once quiet cabin with warmth and purpose. On a particularly beautiful May morning, Jack decided to hike to a small meadow where he knew wildflowers would be at their peak. Scout bounded ahead on the trail, while Rusty followed more sedately beside Jack. As they approached the meadow's edge, Scout suddenly froze, his posture alert but not alarmed. Jack followed his gaze and felt his heart swell with emotion. At the far end of the meadow, the mother bobcat stood in a patch of sunlight watching them. Beside her, only 2 kittens remained, nearly grown now, soon to establish territories of their own. "She's still watching over you," Jack said quietly to Scout, who wagged his tail in acknowledgement. The bobcat held Jack's gaze for a long moment, and he nodded to her in silent gratitude. Then, with the same deliberate grace she had shown that autumn morning, she turned and led her offspring into the shadows of the forest. Scout looked up at Jack, his brown eyes somehow knowing, then pressed against his leg companionably. "Come on, boys," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's go home." As they turned back toward the cabin, Jack reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought Scout into his life. What had begun as an act of cruelty, the abandonment of a helpless puppy, had transformed into something remarkable through the intervention of a wild mother whose compassion transcended the boundaries between species. In the vast wilderness of the Colorado mountains, where life often unfolded according to harsh natural laws, a small miracle had occurred. And in witnessing it, Jack had found a renewed sense of wonder in the world he thought he knew so well. Scout trotted ahead on the trail, his golden coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight, a living reminder that sometimes, in the space between the wild and the tame, the most extraordinary connections could form, and the most unlikely rescues could heal more than one heart.